We signed 47 pages, cried in the driveway, painted the nursery yellow, and 6 weeks later a stranger knocked on our door and told us she owned our house. Opening. The house on Carver Street. I want to tell you about a Tuesday afternoon in October when my wife and I held hands across a conference table and signed our names 47 times and believed, completely and without reservation, that we had finally made it. Her name is Rena. She was 33 that fall, 4 months pregnant, wearing a blue dress she'd bought specifically for closing day because she said she wanted to look like someone who owned property. I was 35, in a button-down I'd ironed twice that morning. We'd been together for 9 years, married for 4. We'd been saving for a house for 7 years. I want you to hold that number for a moment before I tell you what happened to it. Neither of our families had ever owned property. Not one person in either line, not our parents, not our grandparents, not anyone we knew of going back far enough to ask. We grew up in rentals. We understood, in the specific way that children of renters understand things, that the walls around you could stop being yours at someone else's discretion. That the landlord's decision was the weather, something you lived under, not something you controlled. Owning a home wasn't just financial for us. It was something closer to a corrective act, a rewriting of what was possible. We saved $94,000. I'll say it plainly because the number still matters to me, because it represents something I want people to understand before the rest of the story unfolds. That money was 7 years of skipping vacations, of driving cars until the maintenance costs made them embarrassing, of eating at home almost every night and packing lunches and saying, maybe next year, so many times that it became a kind of refrain. $94,000. It sounds large. It feels enormous when it's yours and you've built it slowly, dollar by dollar, out of deliberate and sustained sacrifice. We found the house on a Thursday evening in late August. A 3-bedroom Craftsman on Carver Street in northeast Portland, listed at $460,000. It had original hardwood floors, a covered front porch, a backyard with a fig tree that looked like it had been there since the house was built. There was a room off the back that would have been a study or a sewing room, small and filled with afternoon light, that Rena and I both immediately, without discussing it, identified as the nursery. The seller was a man named Gerald Haas. He was in his mid-50s, well-dressed in the specific way of someone who has never thought too hard about what they're wearing because they don't need to. Silver hair, easy handshake, the general air of mild confidence that I now understand I mistook for legitimacy. He told us he'd inherited the property from his father, who'd passed 2 years prior. He said he'd been meaning to sell it for a while but hadn't gotten around to it, and that he was glad it was going to a young couple starting out. He said it with warmth that felt genuine. Our realtor, a woman named Dana who had been working Portland's northeast neighborhoods for 12 years, told us she'd done 2 transactions with Gerald before. Both clean. She vouched for him in the way that people in real estate vouch for repeat clients, not with documentation, but with familiarity and comfort, which in that world carries enormous weight. The inspection passed. Nothing structural. A few deferred maintenance items, reasonable for a house of that age. We negotiated $4,500 in credits and called it good. The closing attorney processed 47 pages of documents efficiently. He had a clean office and a professional manner and answered every question we asked with patience that felt like thoroughness. The title company issued a policy. We paid $2,200 for it. We understood it to mean we were protected. On a Tuesday afternoon in October, we signed our names 47 times. We got the keys. We drove to the house. We stood in the driveway and Rena cried first and then I did, and we held each other in front of a house that we believed, with every reasonable justification, was ours. Before we even moved the furniture in, we painted the nursery yellow. Rena had picked the color from a swatch card, a soft, warm yellow she said looked like morning light. We did it together on a Saturday, with a drop cloth from the hardware store and a playlist she'd made for the occasion. We laughed. We ate pizza on the floor afterward. The nursery was the first room we finished. I think about that Saturday a lot. The specific quality of that happiness. The completeness of it. The way we had no idea. The woman at the door. 6 weeks after we moved in, on a quiet Wednesday morning in late November, someone knocked on our door. She was 62, small, composed in the way of someone managing something difficult with deliberate care. She introduced herself as Margaret Chen. She said she was sorry to bother us. She said she was confused, and then she said the thing that didn't make sense. I own this house. Rena was at a prenatal appointment. I was working from home. I remember the specific quality of the silence that followed her sentence, the way the words sat in the air of the entryway without landing anywhere, because my brain genuinely could not find a framework to receive them. Margaret had owned the property for 11 years. Her name was on the deed. She had moved to Portugal 3 years prior when her son became seriously ill, a long illness, a hard one, and she had needed to be with him. She had hired a property manager to handle the house while she was abroad. The property manager had handled things for about a year, and then the communication had become sporadic, and then it had stopped. She'd assumed there were issues. She hadn't been able to come back. Her son's condition had required her full presence. When her son stabilized enough for her to travel, she flew back to Portland to check on her property. And found us. She was not aggressive. She was not accusatory. She was a 62-year-old woman standing on the porch of her house, looking at a stranger in the doorway, visibly trying to remain calm in the face of something that made no sense to her either. I made her coffee. I know that sounds strange. But I didn't know what else to do, and she seemed like she could use it, and so could I. We sat at the kitchen table, in her kitchen, as it turned out, and she showed me 11 years of property tax receipts on her phone. The deed filing. Her ID. The purchase documents from when she'd bought the house in 2013. And I showed her our closing documents. Our signed purchase agreement. Our title policy. We sat there together, two people holding paperwork that couldn't both be true, and somewhere in that half hour I understood that we had been robbed. Not yet the how or the who or the scale of it. But the fact of it settled into the room between us with terrible clarity. I called Rena. She was still at the appointment. She called me back 20 minutes later and I told her, as steadily as I could manage, that something had happened and she needed to come home. Update 1. The shape of the fraud. The police were involved by that afternoon. A detective named Ramos was assigned to the case within 48 hours, which was faster than I'd expected and slower than I needed. What emerged over the following 2 weeks, as investigators and then our attorney began to piece together the transaction, was this. Gerald Haas, if that was his name, and investigators were not certain it was, had obtained Margaret Chen's identity documents through means that were still unclear. He had constructed a false power of attorney, executed before a notary who was later suspended and is currently under investigation. He had created a shell LLC with a name similar enough to a legitimate Portland property management company to pass casual inspection. He had then listed the property, engaged a realtor who had no reason to doubt his credentials, and processed a fraudulent real estate transaction clean enough to pass every standard check that was actually performed. The realtor had checked his license, which was real. She had communicated with him by email, phone, and in person over several weeks. She had worked with him before, on 2 previous transactions that investigators were now looking at more carefully. The title company had run a search. The search had returned Margaret Chen's name. Gerald Haas had presented forged power of attorney documents authorizing him to sell on her behalf. The title company had accepted those documents. Their search protocols did not include independent verification of power of attorney authenticity. They had processed the transaction. The closing attorney's firm had followed their standard procedure. Their standard procedure did not include steps that would have detected this particular fraud. The wire transfer, our $94,000 down payment and the $366,000 mortgage funding, had gone to an account that routed, within hours, to Cyprus. By the time law enforcement began tracing it, the trail was cold in the way that international financial fraud trails go cold. Not broken, exactly. Just diffuse, and slow, and practically inaccessible. Gerald Haas had left Portland before we closed. He had not been at the closing table. This was not unusual. Sellers frequently authorize attorneys to sign on their behalf. He had authorized the closing attorney to execute on his behalf through the same fraudulent power of attorney framework. He was gone. He remained gone. He remains gone to this day. Update 2. The systems respond. We had 60 days, by court order, to vacate the house. Margaret Chen's claim was ironclad. Her name had been on that deed for 11 years, and the deed conveyed by fraud conveyed nothing. The house was hers. This was correct and proper, and I did not blame her for it. She was also a victim. Someone had stolen her identity and used it to steal our money. I told her that directly, the second time we spoke, and I meant it without reservation. She was not our adversary. We had both been robbed by the same ghost. We moved into my parents' apartment. They live in a 2-bedroom in Beaverton, my mother, my father, and the collection of accumulated decades that fills a small space when you've lived in it long enough. We slept in my childhood bedroom. Rena was 6 months pregnant. She did not complain. I watched her arrange her prenatal vitamins on my childhood dresser and felt something I still don't have a clean word for. Her OB, at the next appointment, flagged elevated stress indicators and had a careful conversation with Rena about what that could mean for the pregnancy. Rena nodded and said she understood. In the parking lot afterward, she sat in the passenger seat for a long time without saying anything, and I sat next to her, and we didn't say much either. The title insurance company sent a letter 14 days after I filed a claim. The letter said that the claim was under review and that certain provisions of the policy might limit or exclude coverage for fraud of this nature. I had paid $2,200 for that policy. I reread it for the first time since closing. The language was not designed to be understood by someone in a parking lot at the end of a hard day. It was designed to be processed by lawyers. So I got lawyers. Our realtor stopped returning calls around day 10. Not immediately. For the first week she was sympathetic and communicative and said all the appropriate things about being shocked and horrified and wanting to help. Then the calls went to voicemail. Then the emails went unanswered. Then her broker's office sent us a letter through their legal department. The letter said that Dana had followed standard industry practice in vetting the seller and could not be held responsible for fraud that had evaded professional title and closing processes. The closing attorney's firm sent a similar letter, worded differently but arriving at the same destination. They had followed standard procedure. Standard procedure had not included catching this particular fraud. They expressed sympathy. A local news crew found out about the story, I still don't know how, and showed up outside the house on Carver Street on a Friday morning. By then we had already vacated. They filmed the empty house and did a segment. Several people I hadn't spoken to in years sent me the link. I watched it once and didn't watch it again. Update 3. The legal campaign. We filed suit against 3 parties: the title insurance company, the realtor's brokerage, and the closing attorney's firm. Our attorney, her name is Patricia Solano, and I want to name her here because she was exceptional, explained our position clearly and without false comfort. The title company was our strongest target. A title policy exists precisely to protect against defective title, and fraudulent conveyance produces defective title. Their attempt to invoke fraud exclusions was aggressive but not necessarily decisive, because the policy language was ambiguous and courts had gone different ways on similar facts. The realtor's brokerage was a secondary target. Dana had vouched for the seller personally, and that vouching, documented in emails, created potential liability beyond simple paperwork processing. Her errors and omissions insurance was real and active. The closing attorney's firm was our weakest claim. They had followed documented procedure. But their procedure had a gap, and gaps create exposure, and Patricia believed we had enough to bring them to the table. What followed was 11 months that I described to people as bureaucratic attrition. Depositions, document requests, delays, adjuster reviews, settlement demands and counterdemands. Patricia managed it with steady competence. I learned more about title insurance policy language than I ever wanted to know. In month 4, Rena gave birth to our daughter. Healthy, 7 pounds 2 ounces, in a hospital room where my mother and mother-in-law both cried in the waiting area. We had not chosen her name based on family tradition or tribute. We just liked the name. She was entirely her own person from the first moment. We brought her home to my parents' apartment. She slept in a bassinet next to our bed in my childhood bedroom. She was healthy and entirely unaware of the circumstances. Update 4. Settlements and the arithmetic of loss. The title company settled in month 11. After delays and adjuster reviews and 2 failed mediation sessions, they offered $71,000. Patricia's assessment was that we could push for more and likely lose a year doing it, or take the settlement and move. We took it. I want to be clear-eyed about that decision. It was the right call and I still feel the wrongness of it every time I think about it. Both things are true. The realtor's E&O insurance settled 3 weeks later for $18,000. The process there was less protracted. The email record of Dana's personal vouching for the seller was damaging enough that her carrier moved relatively quickly once we demonstrated we were serious. The closing attorney's firm was last and most difficult. Their exposure was genuinely narrow. They had process documentation that was hard to overcome. We settled for $22,000 under a non-disclosure agreement, which is why I'm being somewhat general about the specifics of that negotiation. Total recovered, $111,000. Now for the other side of the ledger. Our actual losses were the $94,000 down payment, gone to Cyprus. Temporary housing costs over 11 months. We had eventually moved out of my parents' apartment into a small rental because the situation was untenable for all involved, amounted to $19,000. Storage for our furniture and belongings during the period of uncertainty, $4,200. Legal fees to Patricia, who worked on a contingency structure but still required costs reimbursement, $12,000. Miscellaneous costs, document retrieval, expert witness fees, the independent title researcher I hired for the next purchase, approximately $9,800. Total losses, approximately $139,000. Recovery, $111,000. Gap, $28,000. The fraudster was never found. The Cyprus account was empty within days of the wire. International cooperation on financial fraud at this dollar amount moves slowly. Detective Ramos told me, with genuine regret, that cases like ours were common enough and international enough that the realistic probability of recovery was low. He did not tell me it was zero. He told me what he believed, which I respected. Gerald Haas, or whoever he was, is somewhere. He is not in custody. That is the end of that sentence. Resolution. The second driveway. We used the settlement money as a down payment on a different house. It is a 2-bedroom, 40 minutes further from the city than Carver Street, in a neighborhood that is quieter and smaller and further from everything we'd originally planned our lives around. The listing price was $290,000. We bought it in the spring, our daughter was 7 months old, and I handled every step of the process differently than I had the first time. I hired an independent title researcher, not the title company's agent, not anyone connected to the transaction, and paid her out of pocket to trace the chain of ownership going back 40 years. I read every document myself, including the parts that real estate attorneys tell you not to worry about. I verified the seller's identity through 3 independent channels. I asked questions that made the listing agent visibly uncomfortable, and I did not stop asking them. Patricia reviewed our closing documents before we signed. The day we closed, we drove to the house. I parked in the driveway. Rena was in the passenger seat, our daughter asleep in the car seat behind us. I got out and stood there with the key in my hand. I didn't cry. I didn't feel what I'd felt in the first driveway, that particular wholeness, that specific joy. What I felt was something harder to name. Not relief exactly. Not joy. Something quieter, more provisional, more conscious of its own fragility. A thing you hold carefully because you now know it can be taken. Rena came around the car and stood next to me and took my hand. We didn't say much. The house was smaller than we'd planned for. The commute was longer. The backyard had no fig tree. We moved in over a weekend. The nursery, or what we called the nursery, though our daughter was 7 months old and already past the yellow wall stage of our imagining, was the second room we set up, not the first. The first was the kitchen, which is what you do when you have a 7-month-old and you're already tired. Our daughter sleeps well. She has her mother's temperament and my stubbornness, and I am told this is the correct configuration for a person who will need to navigate the world. She is growing up in a house that is ours in the way that houses can be yours when you hold a deed, provisionally, contingently, dependent on systems you don't fully control and that were not, in their original design, built primarily to protect you. Reflection. What I know now. People have told me we got lucky. They mean it kindly. They are not wrong, by the comparative measure they're applying. We recovered most of the money. We found another house. Our daughter was born healthy. We are not, by any reasonable accounting, among the worst outcomes of what happened to us. But I keep thinking about the version of this story where the title company doesn't settle. It's not a hypothetical. It was a real possible outcome, one insurance adjuster's decision away from being our life. In that version, we hold a $366,000 mortgage on a house we don't own. We have a newborn. We have $94,000 less than we had before the fraud, gone to Cyprus with the ghost of a man who does not exist in any database we can reach. We are in my parents' 2-bedroom apartment for not 11 months but indefinitely, while attorneys litigate on timelines measured in years. In that version, the settlement doesn't come. The realtor's E&O pays nothing because the policy lapses or the carrier disputes or the legal costs exhaust whatever we could recover. In that version, the closing attorney's firm holds firm and their process documentation is enough. That version was available. It didn't happen because of decisions made by adjusters and attorneys and carriers who were, ultimately, responding to legal and financial pressure rather than to any felt sense of obligation. The $71,000 from the title company came because we had a good attorney who created enough liability exposure to make settlement cheaper than litigation. Not because the policy was designed to pay it. Not because the system recognized our loss and responded. Because the math worked out on a particular day in a particular negotiation. I paid $2,200 for a title insurance policy because I believed it meant I was protected. I know now what it actually meant. It meant I had paid for access to a negotiation that might, under sufficient legal pressure, result in partial compensation after almost a year of my life and significant legal expense. That's a different product than what I understood I was buying. Our realtor vouched for the seller. She had worked with him twice before. I think about that sentence in the passive voice it deserves. She had been used twice before in transactions I now know to examine differently. Whether those prior transactions were also fraudulent is something investigators looked at and did not conclusively establish. She vouched for him. She stopped returning calls when the liability became clear. I wonder sometimes if she thinks about the email where she wrote, I've worked with Gerald before, he's solid. I wonder if the specific memory of typing that sentence visits her. I have no way to know. I don't wish her particular harm. I don't feel warmth toward her either. The closing attorney followed standard procedure. Standard procedure did not include catching this. I don't think he is a bad person. I think he is a person who processed paperwork, and that the system he operates within had not built steps to catch the specific failure mode that cost us nearly everything. I think about the 47 pages we signed and the efficiency with which he moved us through them, and the way efficiency, in retrospect, can look exactly like care until it doesn't. What I know now, at a cost of $28,000 that we did not recover and 11 months of living in my childhood bedroom with a pregnant wife and then a newborn, is this: the systems I trusted to protect me were not designed to protect me. They were designed to process transactions. There is a difference. The protection was incidental, a byproduct of systems whose primary function was to move money and paper from one party to another on a predictable schedule. This is not a conspiracy. It is not corruption in the dramatic sense. It is something more ordinary and in some ways more difficult. A set of institutions that function efficiently for the purposes they were built for, and that treat protection of the parties within the transaction as secondary to completion of the transaction. I know this now. I knew none of it on the Tuesday afternoon when I held my wife's hand across a conference table and signed my name 47 times and cried in a driveway. Our daughter was named because we liked the name. She belongs to no story before hers. She will grow up in a smaller house than we planned, in a neighborhood further from the city than we imagined, in a family that holds things a little more carefully than we once did and understands with hard-won clarity that holding carefully is not the same as being safe. The house on Carver Street belongs to Margaret Chen again. I hope it is well. I hope the fig tree is still in the back. I hope no one else ever stands in that driveway and believes, the way I believed, that a set of signed papers and a policy and a vouching and an efficient attorney have added up to something that cannot be taken. They add up to a probability. A weighted probability, in your favor, usually, most of the time. Usually and most of the time are not the words I was sold. They are the words I own now, and I will keep them, because they are true, and because the cost of learning them has already been paid in full. If you're buying property, please, hire an independent title researcher. Verify seller identity yourself. Read the title policy before closing, not after. Ask every question that makes the room uncomfortable. The discomfort is temporary. The alternative is not. Our daughter is doing well. She laughs at her grandfather's terrible jokes. She does not know yet about the yellow room. She doesn't need to.